Okay, welcome everybody and Happy New Year. While we still have a couple folks connecting, we just wanted to remind you all that on April 19th from 4 to 6 p.m., we have the Green Crab Survey, the Pulse event coming up. It'll be combination beach survey and potluck. Amy, I think, just put in the chat the link if folks are interested in signing up for that. What was the location, Amy?
I don't remember the exact beach, but it's somewhere in Anacortes, and the link will tell you. I think maybe Ship Harbor or Cap Sandy. I don't remember exactly. Sorry.
So it'll be a fun event kind of as we're ending this session of the Pulse to all gather together if you're able. So take a look at those details and keep that in mind. But tonight, I'm excited that we are being joined by Kristen Walters, who's going to tell us a little bit about the intersection between bald eagles and Pacific salmon. Kristen is a biologist and director of salmon habitat, climate, and policy at Raincoast Conservation Foundation. The aim of her work is to advance the recovery of at-risk salmon populations by conducting applied scientific research, ecological monitoring, habitat restoration, and policy reform. She holds a master's in science in biological sciences from Simon Fraser University in the Center for Wildlife Ecology. So, Kristen, I'll let you take it away and start sharing your screen. And everyone, as usual, if you want to pop questions in the chat as they come up, we'll relay those to Kristen at the end.
Great. Thanks, Monica and Amy, for your assistance. It's great to be here. Nice to meet you all virtually. As Monica mentioned, I'm Kristen. I'm a biologist at Raincoast Conservation Foundation. I focus on salmon ecology. And I'm really excited to be here tonight and share some information about bald eagles and their relationship with salmon and coastal ecosystems. So let me just share my screen here. See if hopefully this works. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Wonderful. So a little bit of backgrounder. I did my master's research in bald eagles and their relationship with salmon. That being said, I am a salmon ecologist now, and so I do want to note that I'm not an ornithologist by training necessarily, and I'm not an expert on bald eagles. There are folks that are, but I really focus on the interactions of terrestrial wildlife with salmon and kind of that intersection between the marine and terrestrial ecosystems. So I'm really excited to share my knowledge about bald eagles with you tonight. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the unceded and occupied lands of the Sinixt, Secwepemc, Ktunaxa, and Syilx Okanagan peoples in the interior of British Columbia. I'm in Canada, specifically from Revelstoke, BC. Okay. Great. So as we go through the session tonight, I do have the session outline slide. You will see it appear throughout the presentation tonight. And hopefully it'll just be kind of like a touchstone for the different focal areas that I discuss as we go. I'm going to start with providing some background information on Raincoast Conservation Foundation, our mission and focal programs. And then I'll talk about the basic biology and behavior of bald eagles, the threats that they have experienced over time, as well as their conservation success story. I think bald eagles are really great to know about and to share knowledge about because they are one of North America's best conservation success stories, which is really uplifting and something we need more of these days. So a little bit more about Raincoast. So Raincoast Conservation Foundation is a nonprofit organization based here in British Columbia. Since the early 90s, we have been making progress towards our habitat and wildlife protection goals. And we work on the ground. That's really our focus, is to build relationships with communities, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And we also work in partnership with scientists, local governments, provincial governments, and federal governments, other NGOs and academics to conduct peer-reviewed science and provide that knowledge to decision makers to protect marine and coastal habitats on the coast of BC. So we are a team of conservationists and scientists. Again, we are empowered by our research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal BC. And we call this approach informed advocacy. And our vision and mandate are to investigate, inform, and inspire. So our vision is to protect the habitats of umbrella and foundation species. And umbrella species are those whose conservation also protect many other species in the same region. So this includes, for example, wide-ranging predators like wolves, grizzly bears, as well as endangered southern resident killer whales are examples of umbrella species. So we really prioritize those organisms who we can advance the protection of that also capture a variety of species that occur in the same habitats. And we work to investigate to better understand coastal species and ecological processes at different scales. And we inform by bringing the science to decision makers and communities. And really our goal is to inspire action to protect wildlife and their habitats. Central to our efforts are long-term partnerships. And there are a few things that make us especially unique in Canada. We are a charitable nonprofit organization that operates a research vessel. Our sailing vessel here, pictured in the orange square, is called Achiever. And this photo was taken in what is known as the Great Bear Rainforest, which is a beautiful ecosystem located on the central coast of BC that has myriad of salmon-bearing rivers, large predators, whales. It's just an incredible ecosystem, and that's really where that's where our roots are, and where our organization began. So Achiever, our vessel here, is a 68-foot steel-hulled sloop that offers education, research, and engagement programming on the BC coast year-round. And it's also closely tied with our research lab, which is based at the University of Victoria, and that is led by Dr. Chris Daremont. And Chris and his team of graduate students conduct science informed by people and place, and they really investigate important and urgent problems and opportunities, which are often identified by the Indigenous nations in which we partner. And while the lab has a geographic focus on the Great Bear Rainforest, the goal is that the insights and applications that are gained through the research that the lab does can have a global reach. We also operate a conservation genetics lab out of the Canadian federal government's Pacific Science Enterprise Center, which is located in West Vancouver. And here we investigate the population genetics of many coastal species, including endangered southern resident killer whales, coastal wolves, and wild salmon populations. And this is my colleague, Dr. Adam Warner, who is our lead geneticist here doing some sample analysis. And in terms of our programs, Raincoast is split up into a number of different programs focused on different species. So the Cetacean Conservation Research Program studies the biology, ecology, and behavior of cetaceans through various projects to help us address and answer questions that illuminate both their susceptibility and their resilience to threats. And this knowledge contributes to the development and assessment of mitigation efforts. And really the goal of the program is to advance the recovery and protect at-risk marine mammal species by mitigating these impacts, such as underwater noise, disturbance, and prey depletion. Our wolf conservation program are working towards shifting the provincial management of gray wolves away from a poorly informed and exploitation-based model to one that respects the welfare of wolves and their important role in functioning ecosystems. And our ultimate goal is to end the killing of wolves in BC for the purposes of predator control, trophy hunting, and perceived competition for shared prey. The Forest Conservation Program is focused on addressing biodiversity loss, climate change, and other human-caused stressors in the coastal Douglas fir zone, which is really unique. It has a very limited geographic extent. It only occurs within BC. I think it trickles down into Washington as well, on the southern edge of Vancouver Island, the Gulf Islands, and then just a sliver of BC's mainland. So our goal is really to strengthen protection and increase the stewardship of this globally rare ecosystem. Our Healthy Waters program is led by our senior toxicologist, Peter Ross, who's pictured here with me. We're collecting samples. And our goal is to establish a community-oriented water pollution monitoring capacity to provide insight into the quality of water quality for human consumption and the habitats of salmon and whales. And so we do this by looking at a suite of contaminants and water samples that we collect from pesticides to PCBs. There's all kinds of chemicals that are unregulated that end up in our water that can affect the different organisms that live there. And so our goal is to better understand that and to inform policy around water regulation. We also have a Salish Sea Emerging Stewards program, and this is a youth-based education program. The program blends Indigenous knowledge and Western science using hands-on, interactive, and experiential learning in watersheds, forests, and estuaries. And again, it happens on Achiever, which is really exciting. And the goal of the program is to provide experiential learning opportunities to Indigenous and underserved youth throughout the Salish Sea. And finally, my program, the Wild Salmon Program. The goal of the Wild Salmon Program is to ensure that wild salmon thrive across their historic range at abundance levels that sustain wildlife and communities. So we offer solutions to the systemic problems that drive short-sighted and commodity-based decisions on the land, in the water, and over resources by all levels of government. And to do this, we conduct research, we do habitat restoration, we do a lot of different things, and I'm lucky to work with some wonderful people. Okay, real briefly, just as a little bit more context to set the stage. So Raincoast really focuses, and sorry, I have a second screen here, so you may see me looking to the right here, but just bear with me. We focus our efforts on the Fraser River watershed, which in British Columbia, you can see the map here. It drains 1/3 of the province. Its headwaters are in the Rocky Mountains. It runs 1,375 kilometers down to the Salish Sea. It's the largest salmon producing river in Canada, and it's the 11th longest river in the world. And compared to the Columbia River, it has no dams on its main stem. So it provides a lot of habitat for salmon. And it supports 54 unique populations of salmon. And Chinook salmon from the Fraser River watershed are some of the most important prey resources for endangered southern resident killer whales due to their large body size and high fat content. So not only are these fish important for bald eagles, which we'll discuss, but they also are really important for a lot of different species. And just to share a conservation success story, because I think we need more of those, as I mentioned, this is some habitat restoration work we've been doing in the Fraser River estuary, which if you've ever been to Vancouver, the Fraser River empties kind of like right outside Vancouver. In fact, like the forested area that you see on the right side of this photo, that is the campus, the University of British Columbia campus. So it winds its way right through the heart of Vancouver and empties out into the Salish Sea here. And there were these large jetties with European colonization that were built into the estuary of the river to direct water flow and sediment out of the river into the Salish Sea. And that acted as a way to keep the channels of the river deep enough for large barges and boats to move upriver to transport goods. But as you can imagine, if you are a small juvenile salmon out migrating down the river, these jetties essentially shoot you straight out into the salty Salish Sea and prevent you from accessing really important salt marsh and eelgrass habitat that juvenile fish need to feed and grow before they enter the ocean. And they also need that time in brackish water to adjust slowly to saltwater. So what we've done over the last handful of years is create these breaches, which you'll see in this photo is this gap basically in this jetty. And it allows, it's almost like an exit ramp for juvenile salmon to access the estuary and have that really critical rearing time before they migrate out to the ocean. So we've seen we've done a lot of effectiveness monitoring to determine the use and fish passage through these jetty breaches. And we have seen a really high success rates and passage rates using these breaches. by juvenile fish. So it's been really great to see, and we hope that over time it helps contribute to their recovery. So just a little win I wanted to share. Okay, so here we are at our session outline. I've provided a little bit of overview about Rain Coast Conservation Foundation. If you're curious to learn more about our organization or our work, I would encourage you to visit our website, or you can reach out to me, but we do lots of great things. And we work with lots of wonderful people as well. Okay, so I'm going to move into discussing tonight's topic, bald eagles, and identify some basic biology and their behavior, as well as their migration patterns, which will be foundational context for later in the session when we talk about how they interact with other species. Okay, so distribution. Bald eagles are widely distributed across North America, spanning from the west coast to the east coast and ranging from Canada's boreal forest in the north to the northern Mexico, which is the southern part of their range. And this range covers approximately 2.5 million square kilometers. And what's great is bald eagles are endemic to North America, meaning that they don't occur anywhere else in the world, which makes them quite special to our countries. And they really rely on forested habitats close to lakes, rivers, marshes, and coastal areas. They are tolerant of human development and can live and nest near communities, but they do prefer intact habitats. And many bald eagles complete annual migrations when they fly north to the boreal forest for their summer breeding season, and then they return south for winter. And you can see this in this map where the orange in the northern part, like in Canada and up into Alaska, is the summer breeding range. And then the blue is the winter range. You will see like along our coasts of BC and Washington, the Pacific Northwest, up in Alaska, and then some parts of the lower 48, as well as the southern eastern parts of the US. They spend, like the eagles stay there year round. So those are resident eagles. They don't migrate north or south. And we will talk about that more specifically in terms of the Pacific Northwest later on. Let's see here. Okay, so in the Pacific Northwest, we do have resident birds. Some migrate north, especially younger birds that are still establishing their territories, trying to find a mate. But for mated birds that stay year-round, often that has to do with there's really great food available to them year-round. A lot of this is spawning salmon, which spawn from spring all the way through winter, and so provides almost more than half a year of food for them. But there's also a lot of different migratory birds, small mammals, crustaceans. There's a lot of different marine and terrestrial food for them. So they end up just staying nearby. But for those eagles, especially juvenile birds that end up flying north, they end up tracking spawning salmon as they return to their natal river. So salmon spawning happens earlier in northern latitudes. And if you imagine and you think about this map, as eagles are up in the northern part of the hemisphere during breeding season, and salmon are returning to their natal rivers on the coast in spring, they have this food source that they can then start to track south as salmon migrate later and later in the year further south to their spawning streams. So they have this constant food supply, and they basically follow it from north to south as salmon complete their spawning cycles. After spawning is complete, coho wrap up their spawning in December and January. Then bald eagles will often transition to hunting. So they are primarily scavengers. That is their preferred foraging technique and foraging behavior, but they will hunt, and particularly when there's not carcasses, like salmon carcasses available. So they do transition to hunting ducks, other birds, and small mammals later in the winter months. Bald eagles have amazing eyesight. They can see 4 to 7 times better than human beings, and they also have a wider eyesight than us. If you imagine like a wide angle lens, they can see through a wide angle lens, if you will, and they also can see ultraviolet rays. So they have this amazing vision capability that really allows them to see other bald eagles soaring from quite far away, as well as they can spot potential prey from really far distances as well. The wingspan of a bald eagle can extend more than 2 meters or 6 feet-ish, and they can stand up to 3 feet tall. They do primarily eat fish. They're quite skilled at swooping down and plucking up a meal out of the water with their talons. But again, they will eat other small mammals, birds, crustaceans, and reptiles, even in their southern range. Bald eagles will sometimes gorge, especially in the salmon spawning season when there's a high abundance of carcasses, where they will ingest a large amount of food and digest it over several days. I have seen during my research eagles so full that they can barely take off. They're flapping their wings as hard as they can, and their bellies are just so full it's weighing them down. But on the flip side, they can also survive fasting for many days and even weeks. So they do have this high adaptability in terms of prey abundance, and they can either gorge and kind of stock up or fast and survive when prey isn't as available. And they weigh between 8 to 14 pounds, and they can live up to 20 years or more. They would live less in the wild often. Okay, bald eagle behavior. So what's something that I find really interesting is that adults and juveniles have different lengths of feathers. So the feathers of juvenile wings are slightly longer, which makes them really good at soaring long distances. And they use this soaring capability to their advantage to find new mates, find territories. It's often younger birds that are completing that north to south migration, looking for a mate. And because of these longer feathers, juveniles actually appear to be bigger than adults, and they're often confused for golden eagles, but they're not. However, these long feathers make them less nimble in the air, which is where adults excel. So adults have shorter wing and tail feathers, which makes them much more agile, and they're able to quickly turn, stop, and dive in the air to secure prey, defend their nest, and assert dominance. And you can see this if you are ever on a salmon-bearing river and there's a congregation of eagles. You can see that adults are really nimble and will dive, and you can see them kind of fluctuating their tails like this, and it allows them to pivot really quickly mid-flight, whereas juveniles are a little bit more cumbersome. They're still learning all these techniques and how to fly. And so as they grow older and their adult plumage comes in, they will acquire these capabilities. But when they're younger, they have these longer tail and wing feathers. Female bald eagles are also about 30% larger than males, which is a rule of thumb that applies across birds of prey in general. And to secure a mate, bald eagles often conduct a courtship display where the male and the female will fly high in the air. They will lock talons and spiral down to the ground and wait until the last minute to separate. It's very dramatic. And once they secure a mate, they mate for life. And they will also defend their nesting territory from other individuals. So I actually have, let's see. I have this courtship video that I can show you. It is quite short, but you can see the eagles come together, where they lock talons and then start to spiral down. And I think they show it again in slow motion. Yeah. So you will see this, and they will come quite close to the ground. And it's amazing. But they basically will do this to assess the compatibility, if you will, of a potential mate. And once they have secured that mate, they do mate for life. The only reason they separate is if one of them dies. and or they will separate if they don't have a successful clutch. So if they're having trouble breeding successfully, occasionally they will separate and look for another mate, but typically they mate for life. Okay, let's see here. Oopsie. Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay. So they go through a really intensive nest building process where they will select a site in a conifer tree that is not quite at the crown, but most of the way up. And they will spend up to 3 months building a nest. They will build the nest out of different materials that they acquire. And sorry, again, just navigating my screens here. The nest can be really large, typically 5 to 6 feet in diameter and from 2 to 4 feet tall. And they can range in shape from kind of cylindrical to conical, depending on the supporting tree. And both sexes bring materials to the nest, but the female does most of the placement of those materials. And they weave together sticks and fill the cracks with softer materials such as grass, moss, or different vegetation available. And then they kind of pad the inside the nest with lichen and other fine woody material, and then even use downy feathers and greenery to kind of pad the nest. They can, again, take up to 3 months to build, and they will use the same nest year after year and even do renovations on it. So they'll come back and kind of spruce it up, if you will. When they breed, they typically lay 1 to 3 eggs in clutches, and clutch is the number of eggs laid per nesting attempt. Some eagles will make more than 1 nesting attempt per year, but 1 is pretty typical. And clutch sizes can differ not only among eagles, but even within individuals, or sorry, not only among populations, but amongst individuals as well. And once the eggs are laid, both males and females share incubation duties, although the female does the majority of it, but they will, both of them, produce brood patches, which is basically where they lose their feathers on their chest, and it's a bare patch of skin, and it is where they lie on the eggs for incubation. Sorry, neighbor's dog. When one eagle is sitting on the eggs, the other will be out hunting. Gestation of the eggs is around 35 days, and once hatched, the chicks will remain in the nest for about 2.5 to 3 months and are fed by their parents. Young eagles are called eaglets, and they have light gray and fluffy feathers when they first hatch. And then the feathers turn dark brown when they're about 12 weeks old and they're ready to leave the nest. And then when they do fledge and leave the nest, they are fully grown and become independent juveniles. And these juveniles have mottled brown and white feathers. And the completely white head and tail feathers, that is very, symbolic of the bald eagle that we think of a bald eagle. They don't grow those feathers until they're 4 to 5 years of age. Okay, so that was an overview of basic biology and their movement patterns. And now I'm going to recap on the significant threats that face bald eagles over the last century and their success story and recovery. So the historical and current threats to bald eagles. While bald eagles were abundant in North America, they became quite rare during the mid to late 1900s, which was caused by several factors, primarily including trapping, shooting, and poisoning. And the biggest factor was reproductive failures caused by insecticides. And the adverse effects of contaminants is what I'll focus on today as the primary historical threat to eagles. But despite these threats, there was a lot of great policy and legislative decisions that were made in the last century, sorry about that, to advance their recovery. And then ongoing threats to bald eagles are not necessarily to bald eagles themselves, but more their prey resources. And I'm going to focus on threats to salmon populations. That being said, they do experience poisoning from lead, and that comes from ammunition that is used to hunt mammals, lead bullets. They also experience collisions with motor vehicles and stationary structures such as wind turbines and buildings. And they also are adversely affected by development-related destruction of shoreline nesting habitat, perching, roosting trees, foraging habitats. Habitat loss and destruction definitely still affects them. And of course, they are vulnerable to pollution, as evidenced by the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill in the Prince William Sound, Alaska, where an estimated 247 bald eagles died from oil exposure. So let's get into the contaminants. DDT, which you may have heard of, was a widespread insecticide used throughout the US in the last century. And DDT was used to kill mosquitoes and to prevent the spread of insect-borne diseases such as malaria and typhoid. However, after DDT is applied over lawns, crops, a lot of greenery, basically all vegetation, it could often get washed into waterways by rain and contaminate fish, and which eagles would eat. And this uptake of the contaminant into bald eagles resulted in weakened eggshells, which prevented successful clutches and caused population decline. And by the 1960s, bald eagles were close to extinction, but evidence and advocacy from key scientists such as Rachel Carson made it clear to the federal government of the adverse effects of DDT and other contaminants, and it was banned in 1972. Shortly thereafter, bald eagles were actually added to the Endangered Species Act in 1973, and once they had those added protections under the ESA, the population started to increase in abundance, to the point where they are now of low conservation concern. In 2007, they were removed from the Endangered Species Act, which is really great. And yeah, I just want to emphasize, during the time of DDT use, Americans sprayed more than 1.35 billion tons of the insecticide, which was equivalent to about 7.5 pounds per person on crops, lawns, and pets. And while bald eagles are more sensitive to chemicals in people, considering our differences in size, DDT was initially postured as being fine for humans if consumed in small doses, but evidence has linked it to a variety of health conditions, including cancer. And actually, recent research out of California has identified that exposure to DDT has multi-generational effects in humans. So a recent study found that daughters of mothers who were exposed to the highest levels of DDT while pregnant have elevated rates of breast cancer, hypertension, and obesity. So it's a nasty chemical and insecticide, and it's definitely for the best that for both people and bald eagles and all other wildlife species that it was banned. Okay, so as I mentioned briefly earlier, current contaminant risks include lead poisoning. So a recent study published in 2022 determined that 50% of sampled bald eagles and golden eagles have lead poisoning. The study was only conducted across 38 states in the US, so it isn't representative of all bald eagle and golden eagle populations, but it is a good indicator of the extent of lead bullet use across the US among hunters. And the same study estimated that these lead levels could stunt population growth by 3.6%, which is not too concerning for bald eagles, considering they're in a healthy place in terms of abundance, but it is concerning for golden eagles, which the latest abundance estimate I could find from 2016, there's estimated to be around 40,000 individuals in North America. Other species that experience adverse effects from lead poisoning include fish, mammals, and other birds. And considering this, in 2019, California actually banned the use of lead ammunition by hunters. And there have been proposals to expand this ban across the US, but there has been some pushback. And as such, for now, it is a personal decision by hunters whether to use lead versus copper bullets. But considering the toxicological effects of lead on humans as well, particularly developing children, I think more could be done to advance this solution, since copper is a great alternative and doesn't have these toxicological effects on humans or animals. Okay, so that was kind of the threats category, and their recovery, which is again a really positive conservation story in North America, considering that they were almost extinct. And we gathered knowledge, we had the science, and that science informed policy change, and legislative decisions. And so I think it's a really great model of how how good science can inform policy change. And so it's a good kind of model and case study to keep in mind for our work now. So now that I've outlined kind of the basic biology, movement, threats and recovery of bald eagles, I'm going to get into maybe the most pertinent information for bald eagles in the Pacific Northwest, which are salmon and salmon ecosystems. Okay, so salmon ecosystems. I'm sure I hope everyone is a little familiar with salmon. If you live in Washington, I'm sure you are. You may have some knowledge of their life cycles and their importance, but I'm going to review it and get into a little bit more depth. So, wild Pacific salmon are foundational species. And this is a little bit different than a keystone species, as foundational species are important because of the role they play due to the sheer biomass they provide to an ecosystem and the strong influence this biomass has on structuring ecological communities. And they really support ecosystems from the bottom up. So Pacific salmon also support dozens of species of marine life in the open ocean, and of course, freshwater and terrestrial habitats. And they're crucial to the people of the Pacific Northwest. They've supported indigenous communities since time immemorial. And there's no denying that salmon are part of the ecological and cultural fabric of our coast. And I just wanted to review the salmon life cycle quickly, because it's very relevant for bald eagles. So we know that there's 5 species of Pacific salmon: pink, chum, sockeye, chinook, and coho. This diagram uses coho as an example for the life cycle. And they're called life histories, of different salmon species are diverse and complex. They all exhibit the same general life cycle components, but different types of salmon can vary widely in how those components actually occur or for how long. But something they all have in common is that Pacific salmon are anadromous, meaning that adult fish live and grow in the ocean and migrate to freshwater to spawn. So when adult salmon migrate back to their natal rivers to spawn, if you look at the diagram here at the top, eggs are deposited by spawning female adults in redds, which are gravel nests that she digs. Depending on the species, again, this is for coho, which is November to January, but chinook spawn July, August. So there's a big range. And successful spawning requires cold, oxygen-rich water, and flow. So it can't be too flow, or the flow can't be too slow. The water needs to be clean and clear. The fish do die after spawning, and the goal is that their eggs will incubate over the winter, sorry, I just lost my notes. There we go. The eggs incubate over the winter and they emerge in the spring. They're called alevins. And they still have their egg yolk, or their yolk attached. Sorry, they're this little yolk sac, which they feed off of. And they spend, depending on the species, up to a year in the freshwater environment where they grow and feed, before migrating downriver to the ocean. So as fry, again, they rear in slow-moving protected streams. They're really trying to avoid predation and eat as much as they can. And smolts, they become smolts as they migrate downriver and begin their smoltification process, which is where they transition from living in freshwater to essentially breathing saltwater. And these smolts must stay in estuaries from a few days to up to a few months, adapting and preparing to enter the ocean. And if you remember back to the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that we were creating those breaches in the jetties to allow smolts to access salt marsh habitat. And this is exactly to support them going through this smoltification process and this rearing process before they enter the ocean. And then they enter the ocean and they spend 1 to 5 or 6 years, again, depending on the species in the ocean, feeding and growing before they return to their natal rivers to spawn, and the cycle begins again. So threats to wild salmon. This, I could talk about salmon and threats and solutions for an hour on its own, but I will go through these relatively quickly, but they are really relevant to bald eagles as well and any wildlife species that relies on salmon. British Columbia, for sure, I will speak to BC, is in unprecedented wild salmon crisis, which is being driven by cumulative effects. And cumulative effects are the combined effects from past, present, and future activities. And these cumulative effects can be negative or positive in nature. And the cumulative effects that I'm referring to include the warming of the North Pacific Ocean, floods, and high and low flows from climate changing our precipitation patterns. We have habitat loss and degradation from human activities, over-harvesting, fish farms, and hatchery impacts. And so there's a number of human activities that are cumulatively adding up over time to adversely affect salmon. And despite decisions and reductions in fishing pressure over the last several decades, the situation for many populations is not improving. And I think the reasons for this are complex, but the recovery is hampered really by, I think, decades of our resource ideology, which is focused on extraction. And it has compromised watersheds, rivers, and populations. And so fisheries that have harvested wild salmon to their limits are now being sustained by hatcheries. And in climate change is really intensifying the consequences of all of these actions over the last century. And my work at Raincoast is really focused on the terrestrial environment, and I focus a lot on forestry activities, such as clear-cut logging, salvage logging, and how they affect freshwater habitats and salmon. And so I wanted to post this or put this photo of this cut tree in here because I think a lot of times for salmon, threats to salmon, we think about what's happening in the marine environment. We think over harvest, we think of fish farms, hatcheries, things like that. But rarely do we think about what happens in the interior mountains that affect the life cycle of salmon, and particularly when they're in their really vulnerable juvenile phases in the freshwater environment. And so I would encourage you, when you think about salmon and threats to salmon and what recovery means, really thinking about the headwaters, which can be, you know, in the interior of the state or the province, and then all the way out to the Salish Sea. It's not just focused on the coast. It really spans thousands of miles, in some cases, or kilometers into the interior, where salmon migrate to and spawn. Okay, so that was a kind of a quick and dirty, if you will, overview of threats to wild salmon. And I would really be, let's see, oh, I'm not there yet. Yeah, so in terms of bald eagles, we know that salmon are really important. They're not doing necessarily that well, but they are critical to bald eagles. So I want to talk about how salmon populations influence the foraging behavior and competition of bald eagles. So while bald eagles will occasionally hunt cooperatively, they are typically solitary scavengers. And they use, again, using their really great eyesight, they find conspecifics, which are members of the same species, to locate food patches. And during the salmon spawning season, they gather on salmon-bearing rivers to scavenge salmon carcasses. And they often, to acquire these salmon carcasses, they often use a form of foraging behavior called kleptoparasitism, which is just a long and fancy word for stealing. And it involves pushing other eagles off of a salmon carcass. And so they will use a variety of techniques to be able to do this. They will sometimes swoop down and use that momentum to kind of like scare or push others off of a carcass. They will sometimes flap their wings while they're on the ground and kind of like march towards other eagles to push them off. But really the use of different techniques to acquire a carcass are informed by different factors amongst the group of eagles, which include age, sex, dominance, and other social cues. And so when you're watching eagles competing over salmon carcass, there's a lot of factors kind of at play to determine who wins the stealing attempt. So I wanted to provide this photo. This is from one of our camera traps, which actually we use to gather data on predator populations, but occasionally we get really beautiful eagle photos, such as this one. So here's a photo of 2 adult eagles on a salmon river. You can see the eagle on the left is foraging a salmon, is scavenging a salmon carcass. This could be a mated pair, we don't know. Being 2 adults, it's hard to tell without any footage, but I did want to provide a video actually, so you can see not too much action, but what eagles look like when they're foraging. There's a carcass there. I think it is the same pair here. And this is a smaller salmon spawning creek. There's not too many fish in this creek. You will see at bigger rivers many dozens of eagles, sometimes in the hundreds. And here's another photo from the same camera of 3 juvenile eagles. You can see this is a great depiction of the mottled brown and white juveniles have in their feathers before they become adults. And you can see an adult over here standing on the side, and over kind of in the center is a salmon spine. It looks like to be that they've probably been fighting over. Okay. So, kleptoparasitism is a learned behavior. And so younger birds must learn, such as this juvenile eagle in this photo here, must learn by watching older, more experienced eagles and their interactions. And the frequency of attacks kind of depend on the age of the eagle, as well as the behavioral tactic used. And in my master's research, I did a component of my work was looking at their behavior, their foraging behavior. And I determined that juveniles attacked conspecifics of their own age group, which preferentially, which may have conveyed to others that they were less experienced. And so juveniles would attack juveniles versus adults. This may be because they're smaller and more likely to yield their salmon versus a larger, more experienced adult. But there is a lot of variability. And again, because it is a learned behavior, there's so much variability between age and sex and experience and dominance. And so really eagles have to choose to attack others in which they have the highest likelihood of winning. And so we infer that there are social factors at play that result in this clear age bias we observed among attackers and targets, the individual that they target for their prey. And so I think it's really interesting because even though they're solitary birds, most, foragers, they do mate in terms of the breeding season. There's a lot of social cues that we don't necessarily attribute to bald eagles at play when they are in these congregations and kind of jousting for food resources. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so I would be remiss in giving this presentation if I didn't talk about the importance of marine-derived nutrients and the role that bald eagles play in facilitating that in coastal ecosystems. So if we go back to our kleptoparasitism situation among a group of eagles, often the winner of a stealing attempt will fly with, if they're often not fighting over entire salmon carcasses because salmon are quite big. They're often fighting over like a head or a spine or a tail, a chunk of fish that they can move with. And so often the winner of a kleptoparasitism situation will fly away with the chunk of salmon and go to a nearby large conifer that has a good perch where they will eat the remaining tissue. After they eat the tissue, often the eagles would drop the remnants to the ground, which is usually bones and leftover cartilage. And once it's on the ground, over time, terrestrial invertebrates and small bugs directly consume the remaining salmon available. And then over time, those bones decompose into the soil. And so what you'll have is this marine-derived nutrient cycling that is well established as a key component and a key ecological process that occurs in coastal ecosystems. Most of the research on this process has been on larger predators and scavengers like bears and wolves and the role that they play in facilitating this nutrient cycle. But eagles are a vector for this process as well. And so marine-derived nutrients like carbon and nitrogen that accumulate in salmon during their lifetime in the ocean are then transferred into the terrestrial ecosystem and can actually be absorbed by the vegetation, which helps them grow. And a really interesting study found that trees growing on the banks of salmon rivers grow more than 3 times faster than their counterparts along non-salmon bearing rivers. And researchers out of the University of Washington found that Sitka spruce, for example, only take 86 years rather than their usual 300 years to reach 50 centimeters thick with the input of these marine-derived nutrients. And so I think it really goes to show that this is a reciprocal relationship between salmon, bald eagles, and trees. And salmon, in turn, need big trees. Trees on the banks of rivers provide shade and clean water. They limit the transport of sediment into the water, which is really crucial to the survival and development of incubating salmon eggs. And so in this time of rapidly changing climate, the shade prevents solar exposure, helps keep water temperatures low, which is super essential for salmon. They are cold water species and they need cold, clear water to survive. They have very limited thermal threshold and temperatures above 18 degrees Celsius. I think that's around 64 degrees Fahrenheit can cause physiological stress, and above 24 degrees Celsius and 75 degrees Fahrenheit is lethal. So this relationship between salmon, freshwater ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems, and bald eagles is really an intricate one in terms of they all benefit from each other through the transfer of nutrients into the forest environment and then the physical habitat structure that those trees and that forest provides for salmon. So I think it's a really beautiful relationship, one that is inspiring. And I wanted to end my talk thinking about I should say near end my talk thinking about that reciprocal relationship. So we are ending nearing the end of the talk. We've talked about all kinds of things, what salmon ecosystems are, threats to bald eagles, their foraging behavior, movement patterns, relationships to salmon, marine-derived nutrients. And so I think considering all of that, we know that bald eagles are doing quite well. They've recovered. They've had this amazing conservation success story. And we also know that wild salmon populations are not doing as well. So considering the importance of salmon to bald eagles and many other wildlife species, how can we advance the recovery of at-risk salmon populations to ensure that this reciprocal relationship continues? We have many solutions available. We know a lot about salmon. We have many solutions available. As I discussed earlier, cumulative effects are really driving the declines, but there are solutions. We can shift our management paradigm of fisheries away from one that is solely focused on harvest quota and to an ecosystem-based model that considers the needs of wildlife in fisheries decision-making. We can also change the way we fish away from mixed stocked fisheries, which are it's a whole topic I could go into very selective fisheries that happen in the river. So you know exactly what you're catching and when. We can also reduce our dependence on hatcheries, which currently prop up commercial fisheries and have adverse effects on the genetics and survival of wild fish. We can continue to increase our restoration and habitat enhancement efforts. And we can also remove salmon farms from our waters, which Washington State has already done and BC is sorely behind on, although we are making some very slow progress. And all that being said, I could spend a whole hour diving into the details of these solutions, but I would encourage you, considering our time, I do have a couple of videos that I won't end up playing. They're animated videos. They're really well done. They describe these exact solutions. in a really fun way. And so I would encourage you to visit our website to see them. So I am just going to scroll past them
The
um,
70s.
if I can,
Healthy wild
to
salmon.
be able to get to some Q&As. But I did just want to end that. Oh gosh,
70s.
sorry. There was a poll done recently asking BC residents if they were concerned about the future of salmon, and 90% of people said yes, they were. So I think really it shows, and I'm sure it's similar in Washington, that there's a lot of people that care and concern, and that if we work together, we can really restore healthy, abundant populations of spawning salmon to support wildlife and people. So with that, I will end, and thank you all for listening to me for just about an hour. I know it's a long time, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. We do have some questions that came in the chat, but I wanted
Okay.
to start maybe by asking, you touched briefly on your master's work and looking at kind of the kleptoparasitism. I wonder if you could elaborate just a little more on anything else you might have looked at in your graduate studies related to eagles.
Yeah, we looked at a few different things. And so our first kind of piece of work was looking at their distribution patterns, which I discussed early on in the talk about their movement kind of north and south. And we were looking at how salmon variability affects those movement patterns. Kind of, we know that they move at a bigger scale, but regionally it's not as well understood. And so we were using ecological theory to inform that. It's a theory called ideal free distribution, and it was really based on the hypothesis that animals will match prey abundance on kind of like a 1-to-1 ratio. And the goal of that chapter was really like science for science. It was testing that ecological theory. And we found that, as you can imagine, bald eagles really the ratio is skewed depending on salmon abundance. And so when there's really low abundance, there will be way more eagles, there's way more competition, food is scarce, versus when there's high abundance, there's less eagles. And so if we think about that in terms of fisheries management or salmon management, we want to make sure that there are adequate returns of salmon coming back to these rivers, not only for eagles, but other bears, predators, etc., that rely on them. So we thought about what that means for salmon management over the long term. And then the second part of the work did dive into this kleptoparasitism. We found that there is distinctions between age classes. All the work was non-invasive, so we were observing from afar. And so as such, you can't detect the sex, even though females are 30% bigger. When you're standing, a football field away, it's really, even through binoculars, it's really hard to determine sex. And so we were just looking at age classes in terms of juveniles and adults. And then there are different specific kleptoparasitism techniques. So whether behaviors where they swoop down were more successful versus like ground-based tactics where they're kind of walking. If you've ever seen a bald eagle walk, it's hilariously awkward. They kind of like walk with a very silly gait. And so we looked at kind of the differences in success among those and some other social cues. So it was very behavioral ecology focused, which was great. And then tied in with the salmon kind of abundance piece as well.
First question from the chat. Within the Salish Sea, how many resident eagles are there in proportion to migrating eagles each season?
That's a great question. I don't think we actually know. It's quite, there is my research group that I did my master's out of, the Center for Wildlife Ecology. They have tagged some eagles, so they are trying to estimate how many eagles are moving. But again, it's kind of hard to do this research in a non-invasive way to get these abundance estimates in terms of migrating versus resident, because it's hard to distinguish individuals because they have the same plumage and they gather in big aggregations. And so it's really, unless you tag them, like actually capture them and put a GPS tag on them, it's really hard to distinguish or tag or just band them. It's really hard to distinguish individuals and whether those individuals are coming from other areas or whether they're resident birds. And so I think our best annual estimates are the Christmas bird counts, and where people will go around and estimate the birds that they see every Christmas. And that's kind of the longest data set that we have. But again, there is the research group that's looking at the individuals they've captured, put GPS little backpacks, or not backpacks, but they're around their ankle, and they're seeing where they're moving. So I can't answer the question in terms of the proportion, just because it's so hard to determine between individuals.
Are there current abundance estimates for eagles in the Salish Sea region?
There is by the research group that I worked with, as well as there's citizen science abundance estimates like the Christmas bird counts. And it's tricky because bald eagles are not of conservation concern. There has been kind of a drop off from the 70s and 80s in terms of research effort put on eagles, and a lot of, I think, focus has been on other at-risk species, and so they're not receiving, I would say, the same amount of like research effort, but there are a few data sets that we have for abundance estimates.
This next one we touched on briefly before we had everyone join us. Does the presence of garbage dumps like the one in Delta affect their migration behavior or behavior in general?
Yes, definitely. This is a great question. So they do aggregate at the dump. They do scavenge in the dump. They will scavenge through trash. And so I think I can't say for certain, but I would suspect that a lot of potentially migratory birds just end up staying year round because they have easy access to food at the dump as well as salmon. So I think a lot of birds do end up sticking around near Delta. And then if you're, once you're near Delta, flying up to Brackendale or other big salmon spawning rivers is a very easy feat for eagles. And so they can kind of bounce around regionally to access these food sources without having to go bigger distances.
Okay, next question. Is there a time of year in the Salish Sea when single versus multiple clutches are laid?
Yeah. Springtime is the time. So they will put a lot of their effort into laying clutches, sometimes multiple in the spring through the summer, early summer, especially if their first clutch has failed, then they will try again. So springtime is clutch season for sure.
And you answered maybe this a little bit after it was asked in the chat, but how much of a salmon carcass do eagles consume?
Yeah, they don't consume the whole carcass. It's a great question. They kind of pick at it. It depends on the state of the salmon carcass. So if it's really decomposed, even though they eat trash, they are kind of selective about their salmon carcasses. So if the carcasses are too decomposed and they're slimy, and once there's other insects laying eggs, they will move on. And so they really are selective about the not only like the state of the carcass, but also what they eat. They obviously prefer to go for flesh. Also, birds love eyes, salmon eyes, and so those are usually the first body part to go. And then once they tear open the skin, then they can access the flesh of the salmon. And you'll see a lot more competition over a fresher carcass, obviously, versus a more decomposed one.
Beyond the nutrient flux from dropped carcasses, where do salmon eating eagles poop? Is it mostly near the water where the salmon die as they take off from the river or beach with a heavy load, or from their nests, which are also presumably within the sight of salmon, or while in flight, potentially over the forest much higher up in the watershed?
It's all of those things except right near their nests. They do kind of keep their nest area tidy, but they will defecate on the beach where they're foraging. Often it is when they take off or during flight. And then as well as if they take that piece of salmon up to a perch tree and they're eating, they will defecate there as well. So and thanks for bringing this up. The droppings of eagles and anything that really consumes salmon are also great nutrient vessels, and so their poo will decompose and and transport a lot of that those marine derived nutrients into the forest as well. So in addition to the actual salmon, it is like their poo and anything else they bring into the forest.
Has the winter eagle count at Brackendale and Harrison been consistent year over year?
That's a good question. I'd have to look at the latest. I haven't in a couple of years. I know we had a pause, I believe, over the COVID, like 2020 for sure, and then or I guess I should say 2020, and then I think they were back at it in 2021. That's a good question. I think it is relatively consistent, and our our regional population has stayed level, which is great. But I couldn't answer specifically if it's been consistent, but I think from the last time I checked, it was.
All right, if folks have any other questions, go ahead and pop those in the chat. One thing I'm curious about is sort of something we hear from naturalists in the region a lot, but the data that I've seen about it, again, goes back to kind of the 70s and 80s, but I often hear that one of the densest breeding populations of bald eagles is here around the Salish Sea. Do you know if that's accurate?
Yeah, it definitely is. And again, I think it's because of the availability of food. While they're distributed throughout North America, in the Pacific Northwest, all the way up to Alaska, there's also a very dense population of bald eagles in Alaska. Um, there's so much abundance of food for them really throughout the year, more or less. And so I think because of that, they've had such an incredible recovery trajectory in the Pacific Northwest, as well as their abundance levels can be maintained because of salmon abundance over time. So for sure, the Pacific Northwest, the coastal areas, all the way up to Alaska are very dense, highly populated.
So even though salmon aren't doing so well, it hasn't affected bald eagle populations, it sounds like.
It hasn't, and I think it is because they're not solely dependent on salmon. They can hunt. And they can hunt in tandem. I've actually seen two bald eagles take down a seagull before. And so there is a lot of other food available for them. Of course, they prefer to scavenge. It's more energy efficient, but there's other resources available for them. So it hasn't, even though our salmon populations have fluctuated in a downward trend, it hasn't adversely affected them.
All right. One more question coming in. Since eagles aren't a species of concern with their current abundant numbers, is there any information that shows they're having an impact on wild salmon runs?
Yeah, so when and I think the question is asking if the eagles have an impact on salmon. They will occasionally drag a live fish out of the water, or fish one out, but most often they are scavenging post-spawning carcasses. So the salmon have already died, and so they're not necessarily taking the fish out of the water before they would have spawned. They're allowing the fish to die naturally, and then they scavenge them. They will also take advantage of carcasses that have been killed by other predators. And so often if there are black bears foraging on a river, you will see bald eagles eating the carcasses that aren't fully eaten, which is common by bears, or wolves. And so it's kind of like this hierarchy where you have the predators fishing and consuming carcasses, often not the full thing. And then the scavengers start, with bald eagles, will come in and consume the rest of the carcass. And you will see other avian scavengers like ravens come in, crows and seagulls, and try and compete with the eagles. And so often there's like a plethora of species on one river, which is really wonderful to see. So they aren't having an impact on salmon because they do forage. They forage them and scavenge them after they've already died and spawned, typically.
Gotcha. And now is a good time of year to see eagles. Do you have any recommendations on where folks can go if they want to see some of these kleptoparasitic attempts?
Yeah, I'm not as sure in Washington, but I know in BC, just over the border, it was mentioned in the chat, Harrison River is a really great place. There's lots of eagles there, as well as further up, just up kind of north of Vancouver in the Squamish area, Brackendale is also a hub for eagles, and you can find eagles foraging. They would be scavenging coho at this point. Coho are likely wrapping up their spawning, and so eagles will likely be on those carcasses now.
Awesome. Thank you. Lots of thank yous coming in the chat as well. And a request to maybe have you come back and talk about salmon restoration strategies for an hour as
Oh,
well.
thank you. I'm honored, and I would love to. Thank you.
Yeah, lots of folks saying both very interesting and informative. So thank you so much, Kristen, for taking time and joining us this evening.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so
And
much.
everybody else, we will be back next month to learn about herring restoration and some efforts going on in the Nisqually Reach using indigenous ecological knowledge to inform herring recovery. So we will see you all in 4 weeks. Have a good night, everybody.